One hill I will die on is that the biggest bully in your workplace isn't a person, it's the unwritten social norms. As an IO psychologist, I've always been fascinated with unwritten rules in workplaces. That's why I did my dissertation on the unwritten rules of work for people from low-income backgrounds. But I did not realize how big of an impact and a devastating impact these rules have on people until I was in an organization that had the most bullying I have ever seen to this day. I was a manager in an elite organization, and really I was acting in a director capacity, but they paid me as a manager. I found out when I onboarded that they had had many complaints of racism. The complaints weren't directed at me, but I was initially part of the problem because I did not see how the complaints were related to racism. At that time in my life, I had spent 4 years really intentionally learning more about systemic racism and unlearning a lot of it in myself, but I still didn't see what they were talking about because I hadn't seen anybody in the workplace directly talk about race. And this blindness to racial issues was one of the first experiences of unwritten rules that I had noticed, that I learned to notice outside of class, which I was already noticing. And to complicate everything more, there was a ton of bullying, even within the groups that had the complaints. They complained and blamed leadership, but they also fought and bullied each other to the point where several of the entry-level employees quit and told us it was because of the bullying. And still, our leadership did not do anything of substance. They sent a lot of "we hear you" letters that fell on deaf ears. And to complicate things even more, some of the employees voicing concerns about racism showed real ignorance of class differences. Because remember, this was a very elite environment. So even though there were people of color, nearly everyone in the environment was wealthy or from a wealthy background. I vividly remember them starting a donation war publicly over email, saying how much they donated to racial justice causes and shaming people publicly if they didn't donate as much as other people, without taking into account any of their other circumstances in life that might not be why they have a few thousand spare dollars to donate on the drop of an email. And I really wanted to understand what was going on, and I had already started developing my study on the unwritten rules of work for people from low-income backgrounds. So I took myself to what I call white people boot camp after work one day. And this is where I learned about the white supremacy culture framework, which I've posted about on here before. You can see my culture framework playlist. And this training was very healing and eye-opening. And I learned about a lot of norms that hurt people who even are white. They hurt us all because they're toxic. But they hurt, obviously, people of color the most. And not only were these norms behind a lot of the racism that people had justifiable complaints about, I do think they were also part of why there was a culture that allowed so much bullying. One of the facets in that framework is perfectionism, and that's where you weaponize. If you see something that is imperfect, then you use that as an excuse for the injustice, blaming the victim for why they're unjust. So, for example, if I only looked at how their behaviors were classist and used that as an excuse to not listen to what they were saying that were very valid concerns about racism, then I would be weaponizing perfectionism. And this experience inspired me not only to take action in that work environment, but also inspired the second paper of my dissertation, which was "Do the Unwritten Rules of Work Uphold White Supremacy Culture?" So at that time, I updated our hiring system to make sure we were hiring based on skills and interest and not just prestige. I brought in a lot of diverse trainers and made sure to talk about what I'd also learned in that training with our employees. I implemented a no bullying policy. I made sure I rewarded teamwork, not just individual behaviors. I worked with other managers to incorporate listening sessions with our leadership and with our employees. I started involving employees earlier in the processes instead of just sticking them with the outcomes whenever possible, whenever I had control. And this didn't mean that everything was perfect Candyland after, but it did help us address some of these unwritten rules and improve our work environment. So all these years later, I'm still learning all the time. As you know, I'm still collecting data on what are unwritten rules in your organization, and that is linked in my bio, people. Don't think I forgot to put that plug in here. But I do these things to help organizations identify unwritten rules in their environments so they can mitigate a lot of these harms as well. Because bullying, harassment, and all the isms have a negative impact on people and their businesses. If you're struggling with a similar situation in your organization, shoot me a message. Would love to work with you. And remember, ignoring a problem doesn't make you look tough. It makes you look incompetent.